Okay, so I'm going to show you guys a technique for essentially repeating the UV tiles, or using some sort of a texture that has tileable texture process in mind. So for this roof, if we quickly have a look at the UV coordinates, we can see that we have both the inside and the outside of the UVs for the actual roof, and they're pretty much in a square kind of block, each on their own. They don't fill in the full space. We could do that and overlap them if we want, but for now we're going to keep them separate. I'm going to hide this for now, and I'm going to show you guys how you apply a new material. So if you right click on an object and you go assign new material, this will then give you a assign new material window that we can then apply whichever preset material you would like to start off with. For the roof, I think Lambert material would be a default go ahead type of material, and so I'm going to assign that to the actual mesh. And then in the attribute editor, if we click on the little arrow on the right hand side, and usually all the way at the end of all our history, we'll have the Lambert associated to that. If you don't want to go through all these tabs, clicking and holding this button, it's probably a good idea to actually clear the history so that you don't have all this other nonsense that you don't need. So what I'm going to do is just select everything, edit, delete by type, history, and then that will go ahead and clear out the history. So now we only have our primary transform node, primary shape node, and one shader node. So that helps making this whole thing a little bit more manageable. So with the new material, I could then go and replace the name of the material with something like roof, and then we know whenever we assign that material to any other object that's supposed to be like a roof, we would immediately be able to identify that particular material name. You could also elaborate and say, roof MTL, roof underscore material, and then at least that's the material that's supposed to go to the roof. So from here I would then go in and load in my particular texture. So I would click on my little create render node, and we can start off with any procedural texture to kind of see what that looks like on our model, or we can go straight to a file source that we can then reference in the texture. So I'm going to do that, and it's going straight to my source images folder under my project, and unfortunately I haven't copied these over yet to my source images folder. A typical example of bad workflow. So I'm going to grab these textures and I'm going to quickly copy them onto my project house source images and paste. There we go. So now we can see those textures appearing up in the source images folder, and we can choose to have the roof tile open, and that's going to load up that texture, and then as soon as we press 6, that's going to preview that texture on our model. So what's the first thing you guys notice? The scale is way out, right? There's no way this is going to work for us. So it looks like a little miniature dollhouse in terms of texture scale. It's weird how a texture could influence an actual model to suddenly feel bigger or smaller, so you always have to take that in consideration. So if I want to increase the repeats of this texture over the actual length of the model, there's a few ways we can do that. We can either take our UV coordinates, our actual UV template, and scale that up bigger and bigger, and that's going to repeat the texture over a larger area of the actual surface. I'm going to show you guys that method first. So if I open up my UV editor, you can see there's my UVs. If I right click, go to UVs, and then select all my UV coordinates, and then use my scale tool to increase this, watch what happens. And that's how you can quickly scale the details to apply over a larger area. It's the same texture, it's just if the texture was not tileable, then this process would actually look pretty bad, because you're going to see the obvious seams or the transition between the UV coordinates. So that's one way of approaching it. The other way would be to use the 2D tile repeat. So I'm going to undo this and then show you guys how you can do that through the actual texture file node. So I'm going to go back to my material. I'm going to click on my color inputs, and I'm going to go to the place 2D texture node. So this node is responsible for the resolution or the repeats or the exact placement of that particular texture. So if I go to the repeat UV and I type in 50 by 50, I'm essentially repeating that texture 50 times by 50 times. It takes the same resolution, 50, let's say the texture is 1024 by 1024, and repeats itself 50 times. Thus, you can zoom in pretty close and still retain the details. So this is a very nice workflow, regardless of whether you scale it up manually using your UVs or just changing the tile repeats to kind of compensate for that. So let's do 10 by 10. So now we can see more or less a proper scale for the house. Okay, I'm going to give you guys a moment to try both methods. So the next little trick that I want to show you guys, or at least a method for fixing some of the errors. If we quickly have a look at the roof tiles, from the one side it looks fine, it looks like they're running down. Okay, if I rotate my model, you can see these are now running upwards. So we need to change the way that the texture displays on individual sides. So the way for us to fix that is to essentially divide our UVs along the center line and rotate that 180 degrees so that they're pointing the other direction, thus making the roof tiles running down. So it's not changing the actual texture, the texture stays consistent, we're just rotating the UVs to kind of compensate for that error. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my UV editor, and I need to select the one that actually points to the other side. So select the face, this one, and this one, and we can see it's these over here. So we essentially need to take this edge. Let me turn off the texture preview. This one. So we need to take this edge and we need to cut that and then rotate that part of the UV shell 180 degrees around. So I'm going to go polygons, cut UV edges, and that will then separate these two apart. So now I can use the select UV shell, click on that, and then just give it a full 180 degree rotation to the other side. It's still in the same spot, nothing else changed. We literally just changed the rotation, and now we can see the roof tiles are pointing the right direction. Okay, please give that a try for me. So the next step is for us to apply the actual brick walls, and I'm going to show you guys how you can essentially do that using Photoshop and then Photoshop's repeatable texture approach. So there's a few things that we can do in terms of laying out the brick texture. At the moment, the texture that we have for the brick wall is already laid out in a tileable approach. So I'm going to open up the source images. Just quickly having a look at this one, you can see that a part of the actual brick from over here is essentially the matching piece that's cut off on that side. So this is how it's prepared, so that the actual roof, or rather the brick, will essentially repeat itself. So if you have to copy this over multiple times, up, down, left and right, it will pretty much stay consistent. It's not going to break. Okay, so let's get into Photoshop. So in Photoshop, I'm just going to open up that actual texture, the actual brick pattern. Let me have a look. Where is this house? Source images. I'm going to grab the brick small brown texture. I'm going to open that up. So with this now, you can see that fills in the full image frame, and that's default because when you open up the image, it's pretty much wrapping the canvas around the actual image. So the document size, in this case, if we go to images, or image at the top and the image size, we can see that's 1024 pixels by 1024. So that's fixed in both the width and the height. So now we know that if we had to repeat this texture multiple times, that this will stay consistent. We can check this via using a filter, other, and then offset. So if I bring the offset window into view, you can see currently it says 1024 by 1024. So if I move this around, you should see the texture sliding, but you shouldn't be able to see a seam. If that's the case, then that means the texture is not seamless. Then you need to go and fix it. So that's a way to check whether the texture is working or not. This goes both horizontal and vertical. I'm going to hit cancel, and we know this is working for us. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to generate a texture pattern. So a texture pattern is a tool inside of Photoshop that can then be scaled up and down. So it almost takes the information in pixels and transforms them into a scalable manner, so we can make it bigger or smaller for whichever purpose. So this is great. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to edit and then define a pattern. And I'm going to choose, let's call this brick wall. I'm going to hit OK, and that saves this now into Photoshop as a texture that I can essentially use on my brush. I can use that to define a stroke on a path. There's many things that I can do with this. So I essentially want to use this to populate my UVs. So I'm going to open up my UV templates that we have under the images folder, house UVs, and I want to essentially apply that brick wall onto my house. But as you guys saw previously, if you just drag and drop the texture onto the model, it comes out either too big or too small, so then you have to compensate the scale. So by defining it as a pattern, we essentially have more of a procedural way of changing a slider to increase or decrease the scale of the texture. So now we can do a layer, new, or rather layer, fill layer, and then layer pattern. And this will bring up a window to tell whatever you want to call it. We can call this wall, and then OK. And that's going to bring up the pattern window that we can then choose any of the patterns that's either previously defined or the last one that we've just created. And then we have a scaler, so we can bring the scale up or down to repeat that texture. So this is very, very useful for kind of doing this workflow. I recommend this for pretty much all your project work that kind of deals with a tileable approach. Okay, I'm going to give you guys a few moments to do that. So now that we have the actual layer fill applied, we can now go and actually change that on the fly depending on whether we want to increase the amount of repeats or not. So just by double clicking on the wall texture, it's going to bring up the full layer pattern, and then we can change the scale accordingly. So if I type in like 20, it's going to change the texture accordingly to repeat 20 by 20 along the width and the height. So if we look closely, we'll start noticing that we're representing less and less pixels for the actual bricks. So this is something that you have to keep in mind. So your source image that you use to create the UV snapshot for has to be either bigger or smaller to compensate for the resolution. So if you don't want to change the UV snapshot in Maya, if I were to go here, select my house UV snapshot, and then change it from a 2K to 4K or 8K, then what we can do is just do it in Photoshop. We already have it. The only thing is if we do it here, then we're blurring some of the pixels. Just keep that in mind. So your actual UV snapshot will be a little bit more blurrier. So under the images or image, we can do image size, and then we can change the resolution for the width and the height to a higher resolution, and that will just update the scale accordingly so that we maintain more detail. So the way that I do this is, sometimes if you're typing in like large numbers and you don't know what's the next higher resolution up from there in exact number values, then what I typically do is I change it to percentage, and then just type in 200, so it doubles up on the resolution. And then if I switch that back to pixels, you can see, actually let's leave it there, percentage for now, and hit apply, and now you can see we just upped the resolution of the actual image, and then the full layer is now representing a little bit more pixels to kind of compensate for that. So that's a cool thing that you guys can take note of. But the so the next thing, taking it from there, is to actually save out the UV snapshot and then plug that into the new diffuse slot on a Lambert, a new Lambert, let's say Lambert wall or something inside of Maya. So I'm going to go and save this out, Control-Shift-S, and let's call this, I'm going to save it out as a TIFF file, and then we're going to call this house walls. And additionally, underscore, I'm going to type in diffuse so that we are aware which type of map this is. There's multiple types of maps. In this case, we're working with a color, so that's going to be our diffuse map. So this I want to save in my source images and not in my regular images folder. So I'm going to go back up one, source images, and then save it there. In this case, I don't need the TIFF compression on, so I can leave it to none. If there was layer stacks, we could save that out, or we can just discard them to keep the file small. For now, we can keep it big, and then later on when we're finalizing the texture, we can discard it and keep it nice and tidy. You don't want to end up with a 400 meg TIFF file and end up waiting for Maya to load in a 400 meg diffuse just for the walls. Right, so now back to Maya. I'm now going to grab my walls. I'm going to right click and assign a brand new material. And this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to create, let's say, a blend material, because the blend material has specularity and we can make use of that a little bit to kind of have certain parts of the brick walls maybe wet and other parts more dry. So having a blend material essentially gives us that flexibility. I'll give you guys a breakdown of all the different types of materials and what they are used for a little bit later. Right, so with a blend material, I'm going to call this wall underscore MTL. Here we go. And where do we plug this in? We plug this texture into the color slot. So I'm going to go to File. I'm going to go to the file node itself, and we're going to link that up in the source images. Select it, open, and then there we go. Now we're previewing that texture on our wall. So the first thing we can notice is the fact that areas of the window is receiving the same texture brick as everywhere else. So we need to take out some of these areas. We essentially don't need the bricks to be in the window. Also, the stairs might have a different treatment. Maybe the stairs are only cement, so we want to address that as well. So a few things that we can definitely work on. So let's see how we can change this inside of Photoshop. So quickly jumping to Photoshop, if we have a look here, I'm going to bring my just a quick background or a full layer below my brick wall. I'm going to fill that with black so that it's a little bit more apparent for you guys to actually see what we're going to work with. So if we zoom into these areas over here, we can see these are essentially our window frames. So the window frames currently receiving the same brick wall texture, so we need to paint those out. So we can go to our main brick wall texture, and if you look at this, there's no way for me to actually manipulate the pixels because it's a smart object. It's a system that allows us to procedurally change the scale up and down. So the only way for us to change that would be to change the mask. So I'm going to click on the mask, the white box next to it. Then I'm going to jump to one of my brushes. So if you press B for brush, and then we can paint either with black or with white. White being filling it so that everything that's on that particular layer will show through, and black means anything that's below it will essentially be showing through. So I'm going to press B, and I'm going to change my brush size, and I'm going to start painting that out on there. So I'm going to switch from foreground to background by pressing X. You can see how that cycles around, and then I'm going to paint with that. Increase it a little bit more. So you're not being destructive, we're actually painting this on the mask, thus allowing us to go and control where this will be painted or physically applied or not. So I've overpainted a little bit on the actual stairs, if I remember if those are the stairs or not. No, that's also the window. So we can keep painting that out. I think this was the door, if I'm not mistaken. Right, so if you overpaint something, oops, then you can always press X again to swap to the white, and then paint that back. So it's a non-destructive way of recovering the information. So always trying to work non-destructive by having layers that you apply to your masks to your layers. Right, I'm going to run through that, get those out nice and clean, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly apply another layer below that. So let's do something like this. Let's fill that layer with any color other than transparent. Doesn't have to be anything specific, just for the sake of previewing this. I'm going to create the layer, choose a color here at the top, and then we can do Shift backspace, and that's going to bring up the color fill, and then we can choose color and hit OK. And that's going to fill that layer that's below the actual brick wall. So where the blue will show through is essentially where the black parts of this mask is. If I go and zoom in a little bit so you guys can actually see this more clear, you can see that mask over there. Every part that's black is essentially the part that's receiving the blue. Any part that's white on this mask will show the actual brick wall. So it's quite nice to work this way. So you can always see what you're working with. So if I keep painting, more of the blue will show up, and if I subtract from the black and paint with white, I'm recovering the actual brick wall. Okay, I'm going to give you guys a few moments to address that. I'm going to quickly save out this file now so that you guys can actually see what we're working with inside of Maya. I'm going to hit Control Shift S. Just waiting for the save window to pop up eventually. Here we go. And this time I need to have all the transparency and all the layers, otherwise this is not going to show up 100% the way we want. Just want to leave it like that. And then once I've saved it, I'm just going to click on the sample icon again, and that should refresh it and then show you the parts that's been painted in. So it seems like we did a pretty good job. The only parts that's now showing up as these white lines is essentially the wireframe that's now stuck to our mesh. So usually just before you save it, you want to toggle off your UVs, and then when you save it out, that will now pass through so that that pixel information won't save out with the texture. Right, so there we go. That's a lot better. We can definitely see that now it's working the way we want. So the next step for me would be to start painting a specific mask just for the concrete. So I'm going to take my concrete that we have, or the cement, and essentially run through the same process of creating a pattern, if it's a pattern based kind of texture, and then see how we can tile that multiple times. So back to Photoshop, I'm going to open up the texture cement, or the bare cement texture, And looking at this, we can obviously see it's not a tileable texture. So we can either take a portion of this and hand paint that until it looks more or less the way we want, or we can just tile it as is and hope for the best. Usually it's not going to work too well because there's a big contrast difference between the top half and the bottom half. So I'm going to show you guys a way to quickly create like a rough tileable texture. I'm going to go and select my crop tool. I'm going to drag out our section, and I want to make sure this is perfectly constrained to a square. So by holding down shift while dragging this out, it keeps it nice and square. So I'm going to drag it out a chunk, and then I can still move this around until I find a nice place for something tileable. And then if I'm happy, I'm just going to press enter, and that's going to crop it out for that particular area. So this still does not look to me like it's going to work out as a tileable piece. We definitely have this piece repeating multiple times. Anything that obviously stands out as being different from the rest will keep showing up multiple times, especially when we repeat that 100 times across the surface. So we'll have to go and do a bit of processing by, first of all, taking this and using some of the clone stamp brushes. So we click on the clone stamp tool, and you hold down Alt. You're going to sample one area, and then you can paint with that over another area, and trying to get those areas to be not as obvious in terms of seams and those kind of things. I'm sampling from different areas, and then I'm just painting through that. And again, I'm just quickly roughing this. I'm not being too precise with it. I don't want to spend too much time on it. So let's say I'm happy with that. I'm going to then go and run through a process of offsetting these. So if you go filter, other, and offset, we can then use the pixel right and pixel down to kind of rotate or slide this along to find where the seam occurs. We can obviously see there's the seam right there. So I'm going to put that more or less in the center. From the initial 606, we know that 303 would be halfway mark. 303. Let me actually cancel. Check that again. Offset. So 606. I'm going to type in minus 303. Is that correct? I'm just going to eyeball it. And then same thing with this one. I'm going to move it up. And then now we can see right there, there's the seam going this way and that way. If we say repeat pixels, it's actually showing you where the pixels will be repeated from there upwards and sideways. That's just a quick check to see if things are working. If you say wrap, it goes back to the default. I'm going to hit OK, and now we can use the same approach of using your clone stamp, sample some areas, and I kind of paint over these lines so that it's not too obvious to where those would kind of blend together. And you don't want to touch the corners because that will tile again, and if you bring that across, it will break again. So I'm just sampling from different areas. Like I said, I'm being rough about this. I'm not going to be too precise, and that should be good enough. So I'm going to leave it like that because I know if I bring it back to the 606 by 606, it should be pretty much the same thing, except for these painted areas would now be showing up on the borders of the image instead of the middle. Right, so then I can go and define this as a pattern. Define pattern, call this cement, and then going back to my original file, I can then pretty much do the same thing as we did with the brick wall. New layer fill, pattern, I'm going to call this cement, and then that's the last one that's been sampled, and you can then increase or decrease the scale to compensate for the repeats that you want. Okay, I'm going to give you guys a few moments to So now that we have the cement filled in with its own layer fill, we can now toggle back our UVs and actually only apply this to the areas of the cement brick or the cement stairs. So what's the workflow? We essentially paint out the mask for just that area, and everything else will then show the brick wall again. So you can either use your brush and then paint with your brush directly on the mask. Sorry, let me just select it. There we go. So you can either paint directly onto the mask or the opposite, depending on what you want. In our case, we want to have only that area with cement, nothing else. So I'm going to fill this layer with black. I'm going to hit Shift Backspace and I'm going to choose black. And that's going to fill the layer with black. And now we want to paint with white. So I'm going to choose my white foreground color and now only paint the areas where we want the actual cement to show up. You can do a rough paint like this, or if you want to be more precise, we can do a selection. I'm going to use a rectangular marquee and then drag out an area. With that selection, then I'm going to fill that with black, or rather white in this case. And that fills in the full selection for us. That keeps it nice and clean if you wanted to approach it that way. Right, I'm going to do a quick save and then check what it looks like inside of Maya. You always want to do a quick check if you're actually doing the right thing. I'm going to hit refresh over here, and we can now see the cement is refreshing over there. We still need to do it to these top pieces over there as well. So I'm going to go back to Photoshop and check if there's anything that I missed. I think it might be these over here. I think that's what this is. Quick check. I'm not sure if this is anything. I think that's the underneath or the roof. Yes, that's the roof. Here we go, these two pieces over here at the top. So I'm going to go to my mask and then draw out a region for that area, and then I'm going to fill that in with white. I'm going to do a quick save, and then when we go here and refresh, that should now populate with the texture being applied. There we go. Quick, simple cement on those areas. We can still address the blue areas. Obviously that was just a temporary replacement. And I also think that right at the bottom, this frame piece also needs to have the same cement treatment. So what I'm going to do is manually select those areas in Photoshop and then fill that with the same white in the actual mask. So let's quickly turn on the black layer at the bottom and have a look. You can see this edge loop over here and over here, and the same one over there is essentially the parts that we need to fill. That goes for these areas over here as well. So we need to do a bit of a manual mask selection. So I'm going to do the same marquee, click and drag, and this time I'm going to hold down Shift. That will add to my marquee selection. Zoom to the side. And by the way I pan around my image is if I hold down spacebar, it gives me the little hand button, and I can move around my canvas when I'm quite close zoomed in. So I'm going to repeat the same process over here, add that to the selection, and then lastly that section over there, and then fill with white. I'm going to turn off the black layer, and we can see now that the cement is filled in on those areas. I'm going to hit Ctrl S to save, back to Maya, refresh, and we should now have cement going all the way around the house for those areas. If you did this successful, they should line up, and we have a nice foundation for our shack little house. Okay, so the next step for us would then be to actually create some sort of a base specular map and base bump map. So at the moment we have rough diffuse that represents the cement parts as well as the brick parts. So what I'm going to do is show you a few techniques that I can make use of to process the existing pixels into a specular and a bump. Usually what I do is I would group these things together so that I know one group is my diffuse, another group is my bump, and another group would be my specular map. So I'm going to grab all of these except for my UV. I'm actually going to quickly rename that to UVs, and then grab all these and then drag them onto the group button down here at the bottom. So there's a little folder icon down there. In fact, let me create that first and then drag these into that folder over there. Great. And now we can rename the group to diffuse. Right, so if I collapse this, I have one group that essentially controls all my diffuse information, and I can duplicate the group with all the layers and actually tweak that layer as much as I like to whatever I need. So to duplicate it, you just drag this onto the new group icon, or rather you can hit Ctrl J as well. That makes a copy of it. I find shortcuts a lot more accessible and quickly to change. So I'm going to rename this guy to bump. Right. I'm going to disable my diffuse because I know that one is settled. I don't want to go and tweak that. So inside of my bump group, I'm going to essentially just process using levels and curves and basic adjustments to get my color gradients more or less to the point where it will represent a bump map or a specular map. So to do this, you can apply a layer style adjustment. So at the bottom of your layer stack, there is a few buttons down here. There's a layer effects, there's a layer mask, and then there's layer adjustments. So if you click on this one that looks like a half circle, you can essentially create levels, curves, brightnesses, hue and saturation, and a few others. So that's essentially what I'm going to make use of. I'm going to click on hue and saturation, and then the hue and saturation, I'm going to put that all the way at the top of my bump group so that everything else inside of that will be affected accordingly. Let's have a look. At the moment my saturation is set to 0. I want to bring the saturation down all the way to none, and that makes it instantly grayscale. So that's the first thing that I want to do. The next thing is I want to change the contrast between the values so that they represent more of a higher tone or difference between the brights and the darks, and this we will do again with another either levels or curves. Let's try levels. I'm going to grab my dark points, bring this in, and I'm going to grab my light points and tighten that up so that we have more contrast between those two. So just that by itself should give us a pretty good diffuse base for the actual sorry, not diffuse, bump base. So let's quickly save this out, and this time I'm going to save it out as not a diffuse but rather an actual bump channel. There we go. And I'm going to minimize this, go back to Maya, and let's close the UV editor. This time we won't replace the existing one because that's already connected to the color slot. We want to keep it there. Now we just want to add the additional bump mapping. So under the bump mapping slot, we're going to click on the little checker box. This will now create the connections for us to allow a bump map to drive the visibility of how far something is pushing out or going in. So we're going to sample the same file, and then we can change the depth a little bit later. Let's leave it at the default for now and go back to the file node. I'm going to open up the file, choose my house wall bump, open that up, and now we have the bump information being projected onto the surface. So the only thing is there's a little bit too much, and also we're getting some of the UV edges showing up, so I need to go and change the options in Photoshop. First of all, I don't want the UVs. I'm going to toggle that off. Second of all, we might want to change the contrast either in Photoshop, or we could address that inside of Maya. So for now I'm just going to save, go back here, refresh, and that should take out the edges from our wireframe. So now that's not bumping. The last thing is inside of the bump, we have the file linked in, but the bump value under the bump 2D node is still set to 1. That's way too high in most cases. Usually you want to change the bump depth in the bump node to about 0.2 or 0.4, and that's going to give us more or less a nice good definition for the bump map. You can reduce that or increase that to your liking depending on what kind of effect you're hoping for. And that gives us a pretty good, nice, perfect alignment using the same procedural texture that we initially had. So if you change the scale of your bump, then you need to scale the same diffuse texture as well. They're not linked anymore because they're duplicates of each other. So whatever percentage in the actual image over here, if I had to change this to, let's say, 60, I need to do the same for my diffuse map as well. Just be careful of that you don't go and break the linkage. So at the moment, we have very evenly lit specular maps. If we quickly have a look at our material, it looks like it's a wet brick. Do you guys agree? So we want to change it from being so like coated or glazed with, you know, something. We need to bring that reflection down a lot. It looks cool, but it's not where we want it to be. So first of all, we need to go and create a specular map that will drive the specularity of certain parts independent from one another. So let's see how we can do that. I'm going to go back to my Photoshop document and pretty much repeat the same process. I'm going to collapse the bump, hit Ctrl J to duplicate it, replace the name with specular, and then go hide the bump map, open the specular. We still have the same layer adjustments, and now we can change them to whatever we feel like. I'm going to really make this much darker. Darker values equals less reflection, lighter values equals more reflection. So I want to have it very evenly lit for the most part. You can have certain hints of areas being a little bit brighter than others, but for the most part it should be a pretty dark type of texture map. The cement over here is now getting way too dark because it initially was a dark type of color texture, so some parts of it needs to be adjusted independently. So do you guys see that the actual layer adjustments also have a mask of its own? So we can actually go and select that and then still go and paint out areas where we don't want to have the specular to be so dark. So if I fill that with black, then changing that back to the original texture, now I can control that independently with another type of layer adjustment or curves adjustment and so on. For now, it doesn't really matter too much. I'm going to undo that just for the sake of simplicity. I'm going to just save it out as a new spec map. I'm not going to override the old bump map, otherwise we're breaking it. Specular, save that out, yes, and then pretty much the same process again. You're going to select your mesh, go to the actual material, and under the specular color we're going to choose a color for the specular slot. I'm going to click on the little checker box, go to File, choose my path, specular, load that in, and we can now see that it's a lot more matte. In fact, in my opinion, it's a little bit too much. Some areas are showing up some highlights, other areas are way too dry. It looks okay, but from here you can't even see definition anymore. The bump almost loses its definition. So I'm going to go back to my Photoshop document, and since this is an automatic process and it's keeping its live connection, we can pretty much just change this up a little bit more, save it out, and then just refresh that button and the specularity should update. Okay, it's not enough yet. I can see some areas over there, over there. You have to find the balance that works for the actual specularity. Control S, refresh that again. You can see the texture updates, and now we can see a little bit more of that definition. So I feel like at the moment it's a very evenly lit specularity. I would address it one more step. If I go back to my material, you can see there is some other options under the specular shading. There's a specular eccentricity and a specular roll-off. So the eccentricity is like the tightness of your highlight. If you increase this, it's going to make the highlight spread over the whole surface, and if you tighten this by making it smaller, we're essentially making that highlight a very tight ping on the surface. And then you can see, for instance, there, if I move my camera around, that's showing up the highlights. So depending on these settings, you can amplify them up and reduce them, and that's going to give you a nice breakup to kind of see those details.